Welcome to LexTalks, legal topics simplified, where learning law becomes easier and more engaging.
Yeah.
Today we're diving deep into
Have fun.
exchange, meaning essentials and rights and liabilities of the parties. Under the Transfer of Property Act, 1882.
Wow.
This one's especially helpful for all you law students out there getting a grip on property law.
You know, it's interesting how exchange is a concept that's been around for centuries,
Mm-hmm.
probably as old as bartering itself.
Yeah.
But the Transfer of Property Act of 1882 really formalizes it legally, and that's where the intricacies come in.
So let's break it down.
Okay.
What exactly an exchange in this legal context? Because
Right.
it's not just trading baseball cards, right?
Right. In legal terms, an exchange involves a mutual transfer of ownership of one thing for another.
Okay.
And here's the kicker.
Okay.
Money isn't the primary factor.
They-
Think of it almost like bartering, but for property.
Okay.
And it's not just limited to houses or land.
Right.
It applies to movable property, too.
Okay, so it's about trading property for property.
Yeah.
But how does that differ from a regular sale?
Right.
Because sometimes money does change hands in an exchange too, doesn't it?
It does, and that's where the Act gets specific.
Okay.
And sale money is the only consideration,
Mm-hmm.
but with an exchange, there has to be something else of value exchanged as well.
Right.
Like imagine swapping apartments with someone.
Yeah.
You might throw in some cash to even out the values,
Right.
but the core of the deal is the property swap itself.
Got it.
That's what makes it an exchange, legally.
So the presence of additional consideration beyond just money is the defining factor.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that distinction matters because it has a huge impact on the rights and responsibilities of each party involved.
Got it.
It's a different legal ballgame altogether.
Now you've got me curious about those rights and responsibilities.
Sure.
But before we jump into that, let's talk about what actually makes an exchange legally valid.
Okay.
What are the essential ingredients?
Well, first off, you absolutely need mutual agreement.
Okay.
Both parties have to willingly consent to the swap.
Right.
Just like any contract, you can't force someone into an exchange.
No strong-arming someone into a property trade.
Right.
Got it.
Right.
What else?
The whole point of an exchange is to transfer ownership rights,
Yeah.
not just temporary possession.
Okay.
So the exchange must clearly establish that ownership is being swapped,
Right.
not just leased or rented.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So mutual agreement, transfer of ownership.
Yes.
Anything else?
This might sound obvious,
Okay.
but the consideration can't just be money.
Mhm.
There must be something else of value being exchanged.
Okay.
That's the heart of an exchange under the Act.
Got it.
And finally, and this is crucial,
Yeah.
you need proper documentation.
Okay.
Specifically, an exchange deed needs to be drawn up and registered to make the whole thing legally binding.
The paperwork.
Right.
It always catches up to us, doesn't it?
It does.
But I guess that protects everyone involved.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
lays everything out clearly and officially,
Yeah.
which helps prevent disputes down the road.
Okay, so we've got the essentials covered.
Right.
Now let's talk about the rights and liabilities of the parties involved in an exchange.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier that this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, think about it. In an exchange, each party is both a buyer and a seller at the same time.
Whoa, that's a bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah.
So they're wearing two hats simultaneously.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's where things get complex.
Oh, you.
Because it means they have certain rights as a seller, and certain liabilities as a buyer.
So let me get this straight.
Okay.
They have the right to receive the other property without any hidden problems.
Right. They're entitled to a property that matches what was promised,
Okay.
just like in a regular sale.
Got it.
But at the same time, they also have the responsibility to make sure that the property they are giving is free from any undisclosed defects or issues.
So like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
You need to be extra careful on both ends of the deal.
Precisely. It's not just about getting a good deal.
Right.
It's about being responsible for the property you're giving up too.
Yeah.
The Act does provide some guidance on how to navigate these dual roles, but it's definitely a situation where legal advice can be invaluable.
It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here.
There is.
But before we dive deeper into those rights and liabilities, maybe we could look at a real-life case
Sure.
to see how this all plays out in court.
There's a case that beautifully illustrates this concept of simultaneous transfer of ownership.
Okay.
Kamasahu versus Krishna Sahu,
Okay.
decided back in 1954.
Okay.
It highlights why this principle is so crucial in an exchange.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay.
Tell me more about this simultaneous transfer thing and why this case is so important.
Well, imagine agreeing to an exchange, handing over your property,
Mm-hmm.
but then the other party never actually completes their end of the deal.
Right.
This case shows how the act protects you from that nightmare scenario.
So what happened in the case?
The court basically said that title to the property doesn't officially pass
Okay.
until both parties have executed the necessary documents.
Right.
It emphasizes this idea of simultaneous transfer,
Okay.
where both sides need to fulfill their obligations before the ownership actually switches hands.
That makes sense. It's like a safeguard to prevent one party from getting the short end of the stick.
Exactly. It ensures a level playing field
Okay.
and prevents anyone from being taken advantage of.
So we've talked about what an exchange is, how it differs from a sale,
Right.
the essential elements that make it valid,
Right.
and even touched upon the dual roles of buyer and seller that each party takes on. This has already given me a much better grasp on the concept.
It's a fascinating area of law,
Yeah.
and we've just scratched the surface. There's a lot more to explore,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to the specific rights and liabilities outlined in the Act.
You're right. There's definitely more to delve into.
Sure.
Maybe after a quick break, we can dive deeper into those rights and liabilities and see how they play out in practice.
Sounds like a plan. We'll be back in a flash.
All right. See you after the break.
All right. That Kamasahu case really highlights a crucial point about exchanges, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just about shaking hands and calling it a day.
Right.
There's a legal framework designed to protect both sides.
Yeah. It definitely drives home the importance of that simultaneous transfer. Both parties need to execute that exchange deed properly for the deal to be truly done.
Right, and this concept of simultaneous transfer has come up in other cases as well, further solidifying its importance.
Okay.
Take the case of Five Singh versus Prith Singh back in 1930.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What was the situation there?
Well, in that case, the properties being exchanged had different values.
Okay.
So to balance things out, one party had to pay some extra cash on top of their property.
Right.
The question before the court was whether this monetary element somehow turned it into a sale rather than an exchange.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It does blur the lines a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What did the court decide?
They ultimately held that even with a significant amount of money involved,
Okay.
the core principle of simultaneous transfer still applies.
Okay.
It reinforced the idea that even with a monetary element, the transaction is still fundamentally an exchange
Got it.
and needs to be treated as such.
So it's not about the amount of money,
Yeah.
but rather the presence of that additional consideration beyond just the cash.
Yes,
That determines if it's an exchange or a sale.
exactly. And that distinction matters
Yeah.
because it triggers a whole different set of legal rules and protections.
This focus on simultaneous transfer really makes me wonder about the practical steps involved.
Sure.
What advice would you give to someone who's about to enter into an exchange transaction?
Right.
How can they protect themselves?
The most important thing is not to rush the process.
Okay.
Don't hand over anything until every legal detail is sorted out
Right.
and both parties are completely in sync.
So it's not as simple as just swapping keys and hoping for the best.
Not at all. I'd strongly advise consulting with a legal professional.
Well,
They can help ensure the exchange deed is ironclad
mm-hmm.
and that both parties understand their obligations completely.
It sounds like having that legal guidance can really smooth the process and prevent potential problems down the road.
Absolutely. And there's another critical piece of advice that I can't emphasize enough.
Okay.
Due diligence. Because you're both buying A&D, selling in an exchange.
Right.
The need for due diligence is amplified.
So it's like double the homework since you're dealing with two properties.
Precisely. Don't get so caught up in the excitement of getting the new property
Yeah.
that you neglect to thoroughly investigate it.
Okay.
The same goes for the property you're giving up.
It's easy to get swept up in the excitement, but it sounds like a level-headed approach is key.
Yes.
What does a comprehensive due diligence process look like in this context?
Sure.
What should people be focusing on?
It's similar to what you do for a regular sale,
Okay.
but with an extra layer of scrutiny.
Okay.
First and foremost, get a thorough title search done on both properties.
Right.
You need to verify that the ownership is clear and there are no hidden claims or encumbrances that could pop up later.
It's almost like being a detective,
Yeah,
digging into the history of each property and making sure everything is legitimate.
that's a great analogy. You're looking for anything suspicious
Right.
that could signal trouble down the road.
Okay.
And just as you would in a regular sale, a physical inspection of both properties is crucial too.
Right.
Walk through, check for any potential issues, and assess the overall condition.
So it's about being thorough and meticulous on both ends of the deal, covering all your bases.
Exactly. It's about protecting yourself and making an informed decision.
Right.
If you uncover anything concerning during this due diligence process,
Mm-hmm.
don't hesitate to consult with an experienced real estate attorney.
Okay.
They can help you assess the severity of the issue
Right.
and figure out the best way to proceed.
It's like having a legal safety net guiding you through the process and making sure you're protected.
That's a great way to put it. And remember that upfront investment in legal expertise
Yeah?
can save you a lot of headaches and financial losses down the line.
This is all super helpful. It's really shedding light on the nuances of exchanges.
Good.
Any other potential pitfalls or common misconceptions that our listeners should be aware of?
One big one is the misconception that exchanges are a way to avoid taxes.
The dream of a magical tax loophole.
Right.
But I'm guessing it's not that simple?
Unfortunately not. The tax implications of an exchange really depend on your jurisdiction
Okay.
and the specifics of the properties involved.
Right.
It's best to consult with a tax professional
Got it.
who can give you tailored advice based on your situation.
So no making assumptions about taxes. Always best to get expert advice on that front.
Absolutely. And one last thing.
Okay.
Never underestimate the power of good documentation.
Right.
Clear and comprehensive paperwork is essential for preventing disputes.
And protecting your interests.
The paperwork always seems to be the key, doesn't it?
It really is. Make sure the exchange deeds spells out everything clearly.
Okay.
The terms of the exchange, the responsibilities of each party, any contingencies, everything.
Right.
Don't leave any room for ambiguity or misunderstanding.
So it's about dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's with no room for vagueness.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And again, getting legal guidance during this process is invaluable.
Right.
A good real estate attorney can help you draft an exchange deed that is airtight and protects you down the road.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've covered so much ground.
We have.
From the basics of what an exchange is to these crucial aspects of simultaneous transfer.
Right.
Due diligence and proper documentation.
Yeah.
It's clear that this is a fascinating but complex area of property law.
It certainly is. And we've explored a lot of the practical considerations involved.
Yeah.
But we're not quite done yet.
Okay.
There's another layer to unpack.
The specific rights and liabilities that the Act lays out for parties involved in these transactions.
You're right, there's still more to learn. Let's dive into those rights and liabilities and see what the Act has to say about protecting both the buyer and the seller in an exchange transaction.
Sounds good.
We've been talking about all the things that can go right or wrong in an exchange.
Yeah.
But what does the Act actually say about protecting the parties involved?
Yeah, good question.
What specific rights and liabilities does it lay out?
That's a great question. And as you might expect,
Yeah.
because each party is acting as both buyer and seller, the Act assigns a specific set of rights and liabilities to each side, much like in a regular sale.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some of the key rights that the Act grants to someone involved in an exchange?
Well, on the seller side, one of the most fundamental rights is the right to receive the other property free from any hidden defects or issues.
Okay.
It's like a guarantee that you're not getting stuck with a property that's not as it was presented.
So if I'm swapping my city condo for a farmhouse, and I later discover the farmhouse has a leaky roof that the other party knew about but didn't tell me,
Right.
that's a problem.
Absolutely. The Act places a duty on the seller to be completely upfront about any known defects in the property they're exchanging.
Okay.
This covers everything from structural problems to boundary disputes, anything that could impact the value or enjoyment of the property.
So no hiding those cracks in the foundation or termite infestation.
Exactly. Transparency is key.
Got it.
If the seller fails to disclose a known defect, it could give the other party grounds to back out of the deal entirely or even sue for damages.
It sounds like honesty is the best policy when it comes to property exchanges. Are there any other rights that protect the seller?
Of course. Another important right is the right to receive the agreed-upon value for the property they're giving up.
Okay.
Now remember, in an exchange, that purchase price isn't always just money.
Right.
It's whatever was agreed upon as the value of the other property being exchanged.
So let's say I have a vintage car collection that's been appraised at $100,000.
Right.
And I'm swapping it for a piece of land that's also valued at $100,000.
Okay.
That land essentially becomes the purchase price for my cars.
Precisely. The Act recognizes this concept of non-monetary consideration in exchanges.
Okay.
And just like in a regular sale, the seller has the right to receive that purchase price as outlined in the exchange deed.
This is all making a lot more sense now.
Yeah.
But what about the buyer's side of the equation?
Sure.
What rights does the Act give them?
One of the most important rights for the buyer is the right to a clear title.
Okay.
This means they have the right to receive a property that is free and clear of any encumbrances like lieu-rents mortgages or competing ownership claims.
Right.
It's the seller's responsibility to ensure they are transferring a clean and marketable title.
So before I hand over my property, I need to make absolutely sure that the property I'm getting in return has a clear ownership history.
Absolutely. A thorough title search is crucial here.
Okay.
You don't want to find out later that there's a hidden mortgage on the property
Right.
or that someone else has a claim to it.
That would definitely throw a wrench in the whole exchange.
Yeah.
Any other rights that are designed to protect the buyer?
Yes. Another important one is the right to quiet enjoyment.
Okay.
This essentially means that once the exchange is complete, the buyer should be able to peacefully possess and use the property without interference from the seller or anyone else.
So no one can suddenly show up and claim they have rights to the property after the exchange is finalized?
Exactly. The Act safeguards the buyer's exclusive right to use and enjoy the property.
Right.
If anyone tries to infringe on that right, the buyer has legal avenues to enforce it.
It sounds like the Act has provisions in place to protect both sides. But what about the flip side?
Right.
The liabilities. What are some of the key liabilities that the Act imposes on the parties involved?
Well, as we've already discussed, the primary liability for the seller is the duty to disclose any known defects in the property.
Right.
The Act holds them accountable for being upfront and honest about any issues that could affect the property's value or enjoyment.
It sounds like a recurring theme.
It is.
No sweeping those problems under the rug.
Right, because if the buyer later discovers a defect that the seller knew about but didn't disclose,
Yeah.
it could have serious legal consequences for the seller.
Right.
They could be forced to undo the exchange or pay damages.
So honesty and transparency really are paramount here. Any other liabilities the seller needs to be aware of?
Another important one is the duty to ensure they have the legal right to transfer the property in the first place.
Okay.
The Act requires that the seller actually holds clear title to the property
Right.
and has the authority to convey it to the buyer.
Makes sense. You can't exactly exchange something that you don't actually own. Right.
Exactly. That would be considered fraudulent and could lead to serious legal repercussions.
Right.
The Act is designed to protect the integrity of these transactions
Yeah.
by making sure that sellers are legitimate and have the right to transfer ownership.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
But we've talked a lot about the seller's liabilities.
Yeah.
What about the buyer's side? What are their main responsibilities?
Well, the primary liability for the buyer is to provide the agreed upon purchase price for the property they're receiving.
Okay.
And again, remember that this purchase price doesn't always have to be monetary.
Right.
It could be another property of equal value, as we discussed earlier.
So if I'm exchanging my antique furniture collection for a sailboat,
Right.
I need to make sure my furniture is actually worth the agreed upon value of that boat.
That's a perfect example. The Act expects the buyer to fulfill their end of the bargain by providing the agreed upon consideration, whether it's money or another property of equal value.
Right.
Failure to do so could give the seller legal grounds to take action.
So it's really a two-way street when it comes to liabilities.
It is.
Both sides have a responsibility to hold up their end of the deal.
Absolutely. The Act aims to create a level playing field where both the buyer and seller are protected and their rights are enforced.
This has been an incredibly informative deep dive into exchange under the Transfer of Property Act.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground from the basic definition to the specific rights and liabilities involved. I feel like I have a much better understanding now.
Me too. It's a complex area of law.
Yeah.
But by breaking down the essential elements and exploring real-world examples,
Right.
we've been able to shed light on its intricacies.
And hopefully our listeners are now equipped with the knowledge they need to approach these transactions with confidence,
Right.
knowing both their rights and their responsibilities.
I agree.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating aspect of property law with a rich history and real-world implications. Thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into exchange.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for being part of LexTalks. Subscribe and continue learning.